Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are joining us from. My name is Adriana Galvan. I'm the co-executive director of the Center for the Developing Adolescent and Dean of Undergraduate Education at UCLA, as well as Professor of Psychology at UCLA. We are so happy that you are joining us here today to talk about a very important topic, and that is adolescence and how we talk about adolescence. The Center for the Developing Adolescents has partnered with the National Scientific Council on Adolescence and our friends at the Frameworks Institute to share with you some of the strategies and approaches we've been thinking about to ensure that how we talk about adolescence is the most effective in enacting effective legislation and policies and programs for adolescents. If you're here, you already know that adolescence is a really important time of life, and it's a foundation for setting the stage for future development. But currently, the way we talk about adolescence has been framed mostly from a negative perspective. And the negative stereotyping actually doesn't help us help adolescents. So can you slide, please, Megan? Currently, there are a lot of examples in the media of what not to do, of bad examples in framing adolescence. So if you look at the slide, you'll notice that these headlines say things like, suffer, is this generation doomed? They're in crisis. And although we certainly want to acknowledge and support some realities of being an adolescent and really being a person, particularly during challenging times, there's a better way to honor adolescence and the promise and opportunity of adolescence. Slide, please. And the reason we want to stay away from negative examples is because it reinforces stereotypes that are not representative of who adolescents are. It suggests that adolescence is a selfish stage of development, and that they are unable to act as positive members of society, when we know that's not true. There's a lot of promise and opportunity of adolescence. Slide, please. And in fact, there are some good examples of adolescence, and these examples come from reframing the way we talk about adolescence, and that's really what we'll spend most of our time talking about today. So here are some good examples, for example, from the New York Times on the left, that reframes adolescence from a modern threat to promoting good health outcomes, and reframes risky behavior to think about choices and how we can support choices that adolescents make. Slide, please. You can skip this slide for now. So today we'll talk all about how we get to these positive reframes and the ways in which we can still successfully communicate and disseminate our research to policymakers and practitioners that showcase the importance of adolescence, while also help them reframe in their own mind the way they talk about adolescence. You'll also have an opportunity to bring your own examples, and we can help you craft messages for a dissemination of your own work. But before we get into that, I want to introduce the people we co-produced this workshop with. I'm joined today by Joanna Williams and Jen Pfeiffer. They are co-directors of the National Scientific Council on Adolescence. I'm also joined by our friends at Frameworks, Dr. Marissa Pino and Dr. Nat Kendall-Taylor, and then also by the co-executive director of the Center for the Developing Adolescent, Andrew Fellini. Andrew?
Okay, well, thanks, Adriana. Welcome, everyone. Let me just add my welcome to the welcome of everyone else that you see on this slide. We're really thrilled to have you here today. We and a lot of other folks have been spending a lot of time thinking about how we can best think about adolescence and talk about adolescence from a research standpoint. What's really interesting to us, and Adriana and Joanna and Jen and I, we're all core trained researchers, and we've been trained to communicate science in a particular way. We try to make our points clear in a particular way from a research article or when we're talking to audiences. But really what's been a revelation to us is, as we have spent a lot of time with the Frameworks folks, is learning a lot more. And if Nat, you'll have to forgive me if I'm stealing your punchline, But the idea is that you're always framing whether you are intentionally doing it or not. The words you choose to use, the points you try to make at the beginning or at the end of a paragraph or at the beginning and end of a talk are going to have a profound influence on the kind of messages that you want to get across. And sometimes it's going to be effective, but sometimes it might be counterproductive and maybe unintentionally undermining the kind of message that you want to give. So we're very excited to have been spending a lot of time with frameworks over the years in order to help think about crafting our own messages from the Center for the Developing Adolescent and from the National Scientific Council of Adolescence, and to have learned from frameworks and to bring this kind of work to bear on the study and the communication of the science of adolescence. So we're thrilled to have you here today. We just have a few outcomes in mind that we hope we're all going to achieve as we get through this workshop and toward the end of the workshop. In general, we want us all to understand the importance of framing scientific findings in general. What does it mean? And how you talk about your science, and how is that implicated in the communication of science, and whether that's effective or not. Doing a very deep dive on what that means for adolescents specifically. And as Adriana had highlighted in the slides that I showed earlier, there are scads of examples out there of either press or even research articles that perhaps unintentionally frame adolescents in a particular way that really undermines the kind of message that you want to get across. There are also examples of good framing. So we're going to talk about that. What does it mean for the communication of the science out of adolescence in general? And then we're going to take an even deeper dive in talking about what this means for communicating the science of race and racial equality even more specifically. So our agenda today is we're going to have two parts. We're going to be talking about framing adolescence. We're going to start off with Nat Kendall-Taylor, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Frameworks Institute, and he's going to tell us about the importance of framing in general. And then Jen and Adriana are going to talk about how that has been applied to talking about the core science of adolescence, which is a project that all of us on this call have been working on for several years. And they'll get into some detail on that. And then we're going to have some breakout groups in which you're going to have the opportunity to offer your ideas of some of the work that you are doing on adolescence and some challenges you may be facing in terms of framing your work and how to communicate that work. And so we're going to have it kind of as a workshop-y kind of thing as a group in these breakout groups in which we talk about ways that we can sort of reframe and discuss the kinds of communications that we want to have from our own work. We'll take a 10-minute break. And then we're going to move on and do the same thing to take the deep dive into framing racial equity in adolescence. And there, Joanna and Marissa are going to take the lead, and they're going to be using as an example a recent report that the National Scientific Council of Adolescents issued on the role of anti-Black racism in adolescent development as an example, and some of the choices that were made in that particular report. What else should I say? Oh, right. So for the breakout rooms, what we're going to be doing is we're going to breaking out people into some general topics that may capture the kind of work that you do. The topics are going to be education, mental health, social media, and then peer and family relationships. So that's 4 different categories: education, mental health, social media, peer and family relationships. And what we're going to do is put up there a poll, and you should feel free to go ahead and put up the poll, folks, and take a look at these categories and sort of tell us which group you'd be most interested in joining. And then as we go through the first part of this session, we're going to start allocating people to these different groups for the breakout rooms. It may be the case that you may not be in the one that really fits your interests more specifically. That's okay. I think it's still going to be a very educational and useful experience for you. But we really want to get a sense first of sort of the general interest people have in these different topics so that we can set up these breakout rooms. So what's going to happen now, I think, is the SRA staff is going to go ahead and start introducing the poll and pushing that out to you folks so that you can start doing that. Yep, the poll has just gotten posted. So please go ahead and put your poll, your interest in the kind of breakout group you'd like to join. And in the meantime, while you're doing that, we're just going to move ahead. And amazingly, we are already 10 minutes ahead of schedule, which is very exciting and giving us a lot of time to get into the really meat of the session. So without further ado, we're going to move on to part 1. And one other quick question, one other thing before we move on to Nat. If you have questions, please put them in the chat. So anytime during the talk to this whole workshop, please put your questions into the chat, and then we'll have some time to address your questions at the end of the workshop, or perhaps they can come up during the breakout groups at each half of the webinar today. Alrighty, Nat, without further ado, let's have Nat Kendall Tyler, who's the CEO of Frameworks Institute, to introduce us to the wild and wonderful world of framing.
Cool. Thank you, Andrew. I'm going to share my screen really quick. Give me 1 second. And let's see, I can see Andrew and Adriana. Can you see slides look good? Okay, thumbs up, hand up, good job. Okay, so I'm going to tell you just kind of really quick, the goal of this next little bit is to, like Andrew said, to kind of introduce you all to the concept of framing, what it is, how it works, and to do that in a way that is in service of pointing out the ways that it can be helpful in your work. And so that's my goal, is that we get to, in the next 20 minutes, an understanding of this concept of framing, and really a specific understanding of the role that it can play in the work that you do and the impacts and the effects that you're trying to have. I'm going to start just by telling you a little bit more about myself, not that you all care or should care, but that it's actually kind of important in the work that I'm going to be talking about. So I am, by training, a psychological anthropologist, and what that means is that I study culture and how it influences the way that people think, how people use culture in mind to make meaning of messages, to make sense of issues, and to formulate and reach decisions. And I get to do that work. I've got one other colleague who you're going to be hearing from in a little bit, Marissa Gerstein-Pinot, who's on right now. There's about 30 other folks at the Frameworks Institute, most of whom are social scientists like myself and Marissa, people who are anthropologists, sociologists, psychologists, political scientists, linguists. And what we do is we study mindsets, cultural mindsets. So the ways that people implicitly, without knowing it, make sense of the information that we put in front of them, and then framing, how the way that we put information in front of people has the ability to influence and shape those mindsets. And so I'm going to start off by defining, kind of giving you a sense of what this concept of framing looks like. And I'm going to do that. This is going to seem really weird as soon as I switch this slide. So everybody be ready for it. It's about to get a little bit weird here. I'm going to do that with these cows. Okay, so here's the deal. This works much better when we're in person, but I think it's going to work in Zoom as well. Don't worry, Andrew, it's going to work. So the idea here is, if I told you that this cow in the foreground, Bessie, which I think is like the American quintessential name for a cow, I've been told. If I told you Bessie was sick, and I asked you why Bessie is sick, what would you say? And this is the time you can throw your ideas in the chat. I can't see the chat, but I'm going to try to see the chat there. Now I can see the chat. What would you say? Love to hear what people think, and I'll keep talking as you fill that in. Normally, when I do this in person, you get the kind of answers that are like, well, it's probably, maybe Daisy, this cow over here in the background. I think Daisy is another quintessential cow name, is sick, and Bessie got sick from Daisy. Or people would say, maybe there's something that got sprayed on this grass, or the wild and crazy orthogonal thinkers would say, maybe it's Farmer Brown in the background left some of his trash out, and Bessie got into the trash. Right? So you generate a set of answers to that question based on what you can see. So what if I did this, and then I asked you the same question? I'm hoping that this is not too kind of painfully obvious what I've just done there, that your answers would be quite different, that you would point to the pollution, to the smoke, to the smog, to the air particulates that are going on in that background as the most likely reason for why Bessie is sick. And so what this is here, I've just shown you, is an example of framing. So the aperture, the lens, the focus that we're given on an issue, and how that influences what we think, how we feel about an issue, and importantly, what we come up with as the viable solutions to a problem. And so for the next, however long we have together today, I'd like to propose a shared definition of framing that we can all use kind of constructively as some common ground, and hopefully that you can take forward and use with you as you come out of this what I think is going to be a really fascinating, important, and interesting hours together here that we spend, is that when we talk about framing, what we're talking about is the choices that we all make when we present information. And those can be like really big, obvious choices, the values that we advance, that we use to explain why an issue matters, fairness or justice or opportunity. It could be the metaphors that we choose and that we use to explain how our issue works. Brain architecture, for example, as a way to explain how brain development works in early childhood. But it's also really important to acknowledge that framing is also in the kind of micro language choices we make, in the nuances of the words that we use. So for example, it's in the pronouns that we choose. If we talk about they, them, those people over there experiencing problems, and we over here, and our, or whether we talk collectively using different pronouns to kind of connote common ground and shared benefits. It's all of those choices, big and small. And it's also, I would argue, as you just saw from the cows on the previous slide, it's not just about words, it's also about the visuals that we choose and how all of those decisions affect how people think, kind of what they understand, what they take away from our information, how they feel emotionally, how they engage or don't as a result of what it is we have to say, and how they act, the decisions that they make after hearing what it is we have to say. And so I'm going to give you, if cows were not convincing enough, which they may not have been, I think they work for me, but I'm going to give you one more quick example that shows what framing is all about and what it can do. And I'm going to do that by talking about this really interesting study that was conducted by a group of, can you guess it based on the title of the slide, Danish political scientists. And I think that any slide that begins with this title is just bound to be kind of utterly awesome. This is my favorite titled slide that I have in any presentation. So these Danish politicians took a sample of these Danish political scientists took a sample of 964 Danish politicians. These are kind of like local municipal level decision makers. And they divided them into two groups. So group number one received information about the performance of two schools. And the schools were labeled, fictitious Danish sounding name number one, and fictitious Danish sounding name number two. And then these politicians were asked to do two things. They were asked to remember the data, kind of a basic recall task, and then they were asked to interpret it, to extend it, to work from those data to a conclusion that was kind of advanced or inferred from the data. And these were Danish politicians. They did great. They remembered it, and they were really good at the interpretation. They worked from the data and kind of all, or relatively all, reached the conclusion that was clearly suggested by the data. So the second half of this group of 964 Danish politicians received the same data, exactly the same message, except for one thing. Instead of fictitious Danish sounding name number one and fictitious Danish sounding name number two, the two schools were labeled as being either public or private. And in Denmark, that is a significant ideological cue, right? It cues identity and divides people into their respective conservative or liberal progressive camps. This group of policymakers did the same thing, recall and interpretation, and they sucked. They were horrible, but they weren't kind of haphazardly horrible. They were horrible in the direction that their political ideology would predict. So they took the information and they used it to advance their particular bent, their particular pre-existing position on this issue of education, kind of a classic example of motivated reasoning. Now, these researchers, like I imagine some of us on this call have done before, certainly some of my colleagues on this call have probably done before, certainly I have done before, thought the problem is we just didn't give these politicians enough data. And if they had more data, obviously they would come to the right conclusion. So they gave these politicians 3 times, and in some cases 5 times more data, and the effect got worse. So armed with more data, really smart people engaged in motivated reasoning are even better at aligning that data with their pre-existing positions. So this, I think, is just a fantastic example of how a small, right? This is like 4 words of difference between the left-hand side of the screen and the right-hand side of the screen. Small framing choices lead to dramatically different effects that our information can have. And Marissa and I have talked for a long time about how framing matters, but I think over the last 2 years, we've become kind of particularly attuned to the importance of the choices that we make and how we say what we have to say. And I've been collecting examples that kind of range from really obvious and ugly examples to more kind of nuanced and in my opinion, more interesting examples. And I just wanted to show you 3 of these again, just to drive home this idea of framing and show you what it looks like. So most obviously, back to the beginning of the pandemic, was this, I would argue, very deliberate choice in framing around talking about the coronavirus as the Chinese virus. And we saw both immediately how that choice of words activated a sense of racism, a powerful way of othering, that not only affected how people thought, but as the pandemic continued, actually had, I would argue, kind of life and in some cases death consequences for groups of people. So these choices are, in some cases, incredibly significant and aren't just about thinking and ideas. They're about violence and action in our world. Kind of moving to, that's a pretty in-your-face one. Kind of moving slightly more nuanced, we saw a lot of this coverage around kind of workforce and labor dynamics, in which a lot of women and mothers in particular were leaving the workforce. And we saw this language around mothers choosing, and choosing, I would argue, is the verb that really matters in this case, to leave the workforce in record numbers. And what this does is it creates an incredible degree of contextual blindness, right? It allows us to hold women uniquely responsible for these choices without seeing the larger context, the larger influences, the larger pressures and stresses that are forcing this decision, and activates some very available and significant gender stereotypes. And I would argue that all of that is from one verb, one word in that message that you see on the left-hand side of the screen. Now, I think kind of most nuanced, but to my mind, most interesting, is all of this coverage that we've been seeing associated with various groups of people, whether that's people of color, kind of disproportionately being impacted by the pandemic, or older adults, all this language around vulnerability and our duty to protect them, those people who are vulnerable. And there's really good research that both we have done and other social scientists have done that show clearly that when groups are consistently labeled as vulnerable, it allows us, it invites us to other those groups, to draw a significant difference between us and them, reifies stigma, not only kind of stereotypes and stigma that we hold of groups of people, but actually influences the identity and kind of the self-perception of people within those groups. And I would invite you all, I chose this one in particular because I think this has some really significant implications for how we've talked about young people, not just during the pandemic, but for a very long time, and how these choices of vulnerability, at risk, in danger, how these choices not only kind of further concretize our stereotypes of young people, but how they may actually affect the identities and the self-perceptions of people who are in that group about which we're talking. So I've come to use this idea, this metaphor of a key to think about framing, that the choices that we make and how we communicate, how we say what we have to say, have the ability to open up conversation. They have the ability to create space for people to think and talk in new and more productive ways about issues. They have the ability to open and increase people's support and willingness to consider new solutions. That's the good side, the optimistic side of framing. But as we just saw, that a key does the opposite thing, right? A key can lock things up. It can shut down conversation. It can turn people off. It can keep people from getting to the information, the ideas that we want to engage them in, and it can close down in very powerful ways, quick and very powerful ways, people's ability to think about solutions to the problems that we are trying to address. And so I want to just use the rest of my time to talk about kind of the 2 key principles that run through, that underlie all of the work that we do about framing, and I think will underlie kind of all of the content that we go through and all of the discussions that we have for the rest of our time together. And so the first of those principles, which I've already talked about a little bit, is this idea that understanding is frame dependent. And I realize that's kind of like wonky academic-ese. It sounds like something that someone with a PhD probably once said. And in fact, it is. This is kind of a quote from paraphrase slightly from one of the founding researchers, a guy named Shanto Iyengar, who kind of started this field of framing research. And I've come to think about this idea in a way that to me is more useful, as slightly less kind of wonk, 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 is that it's not just what we have to say that matters, but how we say it that is of consequence. So I'm not going to sit down here today and say that everything that you know about adolescent development is inconsequential. But I am going to say that if you want that information, if you want what you know to have the effect and the impact that you think it can, you have to be attentive to the way that you frame, the way that you position, the way that you advance that information, the choices that you make in how you say what you have to say. And again, I'm going to give you a really quick example that I think drives this home and really makes the point in a clear way around the importance of these decisions. So in addition to the work that Andrew and Adriana talked about, that we've been in partnership with them and other colleagues with for the last, I don't know how long it's been now, 5 years, it feels like forever, for the last 5 years. We've done a lot of work over the years. I've been doing work on early childhood and kind of framing the science of early childhood for almost 15 years now. And one of the key areas of the science of early childhood, which has kind of been particularly pernicious and hard to frame, hard to get people to be open to and think productively about, is the idea of early child mental health, that young children, that very young children can even have meaningful states of mental health, and that it's important that we have policies and interventions and programs that address and support that mental health. And so what I'm about to show you now is one experiment that's part of a much larger body of work in which we were tasked with addressing that issue. Kind of, can we and how can we frame issues of child mental health to make people more open to and willing to support the kinds of policies and interventions and programs that evidence suggests are effective in improving, in creating kind of positive mental health. And so in this case, we were testing 2 different values frames. The values frames are what you see along the horizontal axis at the bottom of the screen. The way that this works, so this is a large nationally representative sample of Americans, about 6,000 people. The way that this works is each of those 6,000 people logs on to an online site, an experiment, and they get randomly assigned to one of 3 different groups. So 2 treatment groups and 1 control group. So the way that this works is Andrew logs on, he gets randomly assigned. I don't know why I always do that with my hands. That's like it's like the gesture of random assignment. Gets randomly assigned to the value, the frame of collective progress and social prosperity. So Andrew would read about 80 words that talks about a child mental health program. And at the top of that, the frame, the cue, the prime is this value. So it would say something like, we need to do a better job of supporting children's mental health in this country because, and we wouldn't say it in such a hackneyed and cliched way, children are our future, right? Their positive development, their stable mental health are key to our ability to move forward successfully and progress and kind of experience progress as a country. Adriana logs on, again, this is random assignment, to the value of vulnerability. So she reads the same 80 words about the program, except the lead-in, the sentence at the top, is different. So instead of what Andrew read, Adriana would read, it's important that we do a better job of supporting children's mental health in this country because children are our most vulnerable citizens. They deserve our empathy, our compassion, and we must do better by them. And then there's a control condition who logs on. I'm going to put, I can see Olivia McDonald's name here. Olivia is the control condition. I'm sorry, Olivia, but you are the thin 0 line that cuts across the screen here. Olivia receives no message. And then everybody, regardless of which condition they were assigned to, answers a set of outcome questions that are designed to measure how supportive people are of that set of evidence-based policies. And so what you're going to see on this next click are what I think are 2 absolutely gorgeous green bars are going to appear on the screen. And what those bars are going to show you is the extent to which hearing those different messages affect people's support for these policies, these interventions, these solutions. And so you see 2 bars and you notice 2 things. First of all, they're gorgeous. Second of all, that collective progress and social prosperity value, the value that Andrew received, is having a strong kind of statistically significant positive effect. It's making people more supportive, more willing to get behind, to endorse, to support those policies. You probably also noticed, as your eyes wander towards the right-hand side of the screen, that that value that Adriana received, the value of vulnerability, is having the opposite effect. So not only is it you know, it's not only zero, it's negative in a significant direction. So to translate that for you, if you're an expert or an advocate working on early childhood, and I would argue adolescence as well, you use the value of vulnerability to frame your messages. You not only waste your breath, waste your resources, waste your chance, you actually use that breath, those resources, and those chances in a way that directly disadvantages your goals as a researcher, as an expert, as an advocate on this issue. And so the story gets even worse, or better, I'm not sure, a better story, but more depressing. In a piece of research that we did after this experiment, where we systematically sampled all of the fields, external facing materials, so those organizations that are communicating about early childhood mental health, guess which value we found to be the dominant frame in over 85% of those materials. So if we were in person, everyone would scream vulnerability, but this has to be a rhetorical question because of our Zoom format here. So vulnerability. And what that means, in essence, is that for a very long time, unintentionally, of course, with a lot of resources, the field had been advancing a value that, again, not only wasted their resources and space, but used those resources in a way that worked against their goals as researchers and advocates. So the second idea that I think is really important to keep in mind, which is going to connect to some of the content later, is that when it comes to communicating, when it comes to us as experts on issues, communicating with people who are not experts on issues, there is a challenge, and we all have a problem. And it's a problem with communication. If we're being honest with ourselves, each and every one of us has been in this scenario, in this situation that you see on the screen right now, where we think we have the most brilliant way of talking about peer relationships among adolescents. And we try it with two of our closest colleagues who happen to be experts on peer relationships in adolescence. And these ideas work great. They resonate for people. They get us moving in the same direction. And then we try these brilliant strategies on normal people, right? People who don't live and eat and sleep and breathe the science of adolescence and adolescent development every day, all day. And we find out that they aren't, that they aren't as brilliant as we think they are. And one of two things happens. They either kind of go in one ear and out the other. They don't land, they don't have traction, whatever we want to say, or they send people kind of running and moving in the exact opposite direction, a phenomenon that's become known as a backfire effect. And I want to give you a very short example of what this looks like. Again, kind of going back to some of our work on early childhood, just because I think this crystallizes the concept in a really productive way. So folks in the field of early childhood and in the field of adolescence really, for good reason, want to talk a lot about stress and adversity. And they say things like what you see on the left-hand side of the screen. This is a direct quote from a developmental scientist who said that persistent stress can derail development and have negative long-term effects on health and well-being. So I said it was a direct quote. I made one editorial change. In the original quote, the word negative was deleterious. And I've changed that to be just a little bit less obnoxious and obvious in the point that I'm about to make. But for people working in the field of early childhood, this is like really true. Truthity true, all the way through true. Lots of science, number of disciplines over a long period of time. The problem is that when this kind of a statement goes out to people who are not experts in the science of early childhood development, and I hope this works here. I'm not sure I pressed the boxes. You may not be able to hear this. Let me know, Adriana and Andrew, if you can hear this. If not, I've seen this video probably about 672 times, and I can reenact it for you.
Turn it up.
I can't turn it up.
Oh,
You must not be able to hear it.
you can barely hear it.
Okay.
There's been people that have come from absolutely nothing to make it whatever society's eyes deem success.
Okay. So basically what he's saying is what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. I know a lot of people who have come from nothing and have made it. And that adversity, I'm even doing his voice without trying to, and that adversity is the thing that makes us who we are and creates strength and resilience. And if you could have heard it, it is like absolutely crystal clear that what he is saying is different, is not the intended effect that this expert had when he or she opened his or her mouth to deliver this message, and that there's something going on between the delivery of the message, the intention, and its actual effect. And we would argue that that thing, not to leave you on the edge of your seats for a split second longer, is culture, right? Culture, not the kind of Indiana Jones external artifact archaeology kind of culture, which is what my parents still think I do to this day, but rather culture in mind, culture as a set of shared mental models, of heuristics, of patterns of reasoning, of assumptions that we all have and that we walk around with us in our heads that become activated and cued based on the information that we receive. So what's happening is there's some cue on the left-hand side of the screen, stress, that activates a mindset that we all have and that are particularly dominant for certain groups of people. What doesn't kill us makes us stronger, which then shapes and constrains people's thinking on the outcome. And there's this wonderful quote. It's my favorite quote about culture. Unfortunately, it does not come from an anthropologist. The JFK way back in 1962 had this wonderful quote about, he didn't say culture, but he's basically talking about culture and mindsets when he said, the great enemy of the truth is very often not the lie, deliberate, contrived, and dishonest, but the myth, persistent, persuasive, and unrealistic. So it's not like that guy in the baseball cap that you couldn't hear hates kids and is out to do them wrong, but rather he has a myth, a mindset about stress and adversity that gets in the way of him accessing that information. And so I'm going to end with a quote that I think is a really helpful way of thinking about framing, and then I'm going to hand it off. So this is a philosopher named Richard Rorty who said that a talent for speaking differently rather than arguing well is the chief instrument of cultural change. And a lot of the strategies and the rest of the discussion that we have today with you is going to be about this idea of speaking differently, not engaging in rhetorical arguments, not trying to be the smartest person in the room, but in adopting and having a set of strategies that you can use to position information and speak differently about the information and the findings that you have, such that they can be heard and accessed and used by the people that you're communicating with. So with that, I'm going to stop my share. And I'm done. And I'm handing it to Adriana.
Thank you, Nat. I think there was a question in the chat that came after, sorry. The question was, would under-resourced, kind of earlier in your comments, would under-resourced be considered similar to at-risk? This was around the conversation about othering and talking about the most vulnerable.
Yeah, so I have a colleague named Myra Jones-Taylor who works in the field of early childhood, and she has this way of talking where she talks about communities being overburdened and under-resourced. And I think that's probably kind of a mouthful, but I think that that's a really productive way of not saying at risk or vulnerable, but really nodding to the fact that these are problems. This is a situation that is not merely a function of people's effort and drive and willpower and gumption. So some way of nodding to the kind of, without saying systems or structures, kind of the component of systems or structures that introduces this adversity, I think is the direction that I lean when I think about coming up with different concepts. So I think overburdened and under-resourced does that really well. Again, it's kind of a mouthful. I wish it was one word or two words rather than four. But yeah, whoever answered that question, I think you're kind of moving in the right direction in terms of that framing.
Okay, and then maybe just one more. Any thoughts on how we frame the how and the why of chronic stress derailing adult development?
I'd love to hear what other people think as well. I mean, I can take a stab at that. I think it's, so in the early childhood development work, that kind of task is accomplished through the combination of two metaphors and careful framing around the second one. The idea of brain architecture, that brains are built through kind of a process that is similar to that used to construct a house or a building, kind of bottom up. Foundation is really important. Ordering of systems matters, inputs matter, coupled with or paired with this idea of toxic stress, which is a metaphor that comes out of our work with the Harvard Center on the Developing Child and the National Scientific Council on the Developing Child, which is really designed to counter this idea of what doesn't kill us makes us stronger. So the idea that there are different types of stress, some stress is positive, other stress is tolerable when it occurs in the relation, kind of in a buffering relationship. I'm talking with young kids here, but there's other experiences of adversity which create a toxic response, a toxic biological response. When I talk about careful framing, I mean that you can't just leave people with toxic stress. There has to be something that comes after that talks about plasticity and resilience and solutions. But that kind of that story, that trajectory of communications devices is the way that we've addressed that how and why in terms of significant chronic adversity in early childhood. I think there's important differences when we talk about adolescence, but I think the key move there is kind of the same move in the first comment that you elevated, Adriana, which is there has to be a focus on context and systems as the sources of that adversity, but there always has to be room, especially when we're communicating about adolescents and adolescents, for agency, for choice, for control, for power within and over those systems. And so it's not just enough to nod to the systemic sources of adversity. We have to always keep a space in our story and a slot in our narrative for people having agency and power and the ability to have control to various degrees over those sources of adversity, over those challenges.
Great, thank you. I think that's a really good lead into.
Adriana, you just muted yourself.
Sorry about that. Okay, I don't know what you heard, but what I said is, I think that, thank you, Nat, that was really fabulous. And I learned something from you every time. Now we're going to transition a little bit into what Jen and I are going to talk about, and that is the core science of adolescence that we created along with frameworks. And I think this is builds on what Nat was saying, that in order to frame, we first need to know what it is we're going to frame. So maybe, Megan, will you please start sharing the slides? Okay, so I will talk briefly, just for about 5 minutes, and then turn it over to Jen to talk about some strategies for how we frame this. Our first goal with frameworks, and what brought us together in such a beautiful collaboration, was to think about what it is we wanted to say about adolescent development. And we created with them what we call the core science of adolescent development. What are the key principles that we, as the developmental scientists who sat around the room thinking about this over 3 years and over more than 3 years, probably iterative process, what did we know from all the research our colleagues are doing in the field? What did we know that we wanted to summarize and distill and message about? Okay, slide, sorry. So first I'm going to tell you, sorry, that's perfect. What the core science of adolescence is. And the graphic that you see on the right summarizes a lot of research. And that's, I think, the challenge that we often find as scientists, is that we know all the studies that our peers are doing, and we want to reference them and we want to include them when we talk to policymakers and practitioners. But the sound bites, or the small snippets of information, is what actually needs to be communicated in order to be effective. So we know that the 4 boxes that you see here represent a larger body of work, but I'll briefly describe each of these. So the first thing that we identified as part of the core science of adolescent development is that our adolescent years, and notice that I said our, could reference, I learned that from Nat, that we don't say they, that our adolescent years emerge around age 10 when puberty strikes, and they go through about the mid-20s. when we now know the brain continues to develop. And it's a period of remarkable growth and opportunity. It's change, but it's change in a particular way that lends itself to a lot of opportunity. That leads to and supports the next box on the right, the discovery that happens during adolescence, where we learn, discover, and adapt to the world around us. And we forge a sense of who we are and who we aspire to be. Now, this box represents research showing that the adolescent brain is flexible and plastic and adaptable. And all of those are really helpful in supporting the transition from adolescence into adulthood. This box also represents all of the research on identity formation and seeking out the activities that make us who we are. If you go down to the lower left box, we included as part of the core science that we learn to make decisions, we manage our emotions, and we create deeper connections with peers and others in our community. Again, this references a large body of work showing that the adolescent brain is primed for learning, that the changes that happen in the mesolimbic system are actually really adaptive and important for us to learn about our environment and to help us make decisions. That instead of thinking about adolescents are over emotional, as sometimes is described in the current narrative, we learn to manage our emotions because our emotions are important and helpful. But as the brain continues to develop, the brain supports our management of emotions. And finally, we want to underscore the importance of establishing deep connections with people. The motivation to establish connections with our communities is really important and a huge asset of adolescence. This is a time in life when people seek out making new social connections, and that should be honored and celebrated. And finally, we also include in the core science that we build resilience and develop interests, passions, and meaningful goals that shape our adult lives. And so here we wanted to signal that the activities that we participate in, the things that draw us in during adolescence, are not just for this period in life, but they also help set the stage for the next stage in life. So the work I briefly talked about here is built into these 4 boxes, but this took a lot of work, as I mentioned, and we identified the core principles of the science through a lot of different conversations. And through this process, we talked about what we wanted to say and what were the problems with how it was currently delivered in the field. Okay, next slide. So one thing that we really wanted to highlight is that adolescence is a time of remarkable opportunity, and I already mentioned that. But not just when we identify the period of adolescence. You know, often when I know my colleagues speak to policymakers or other stakeholders, they want to know who is an adolescent. And that's actually really challenging to define, because we know it's not just bound by a particular age range or a particular grade in school, but that it spans a transition period. And so when we give a definition of adolescence, we don't just want to give an age, but we want to acknowledge the diversity that occurs during adolescence in terms of developmental periods, but also what happens during this time. And in general, regardless if you're talking about a 10-year-old or a 20-year-old, it's a time characterized by rapid growth, development, and learning. Okay, next slide. We also wanted to make the point that the changes that occur in the brain during adolescence are well suited and actually well prepared to meet these developmental tasks that we mentioned before. That the brain plasticity that occurs during adolescence is helpful because it generates heightened sensitivity to environmental input. That means that the adolescents are constantly learning about the world around us. That adolescence serves an important function in refining and stabilizing connections in the brain through numerous processes, including myelination, which helps to enhance efficiency of different brain networks. And finally, we know that motivational systems in the brain are highly engaged. And previously, this heightened reward sensitivity or heightened engagement of regions that support risk-taking have been characterized as a negative attribute of adolescence, but in fact, we know that these these changes in these motivational systems help to motivate the brain. They help to motivate adolescent behavior in really positive ways. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Jen. So that was basically the core science that we generated and identified with frameworks, and then they really helped us think about how to talk about these core principles. Jen?
Thanks, Adriana. Just a quick reminder in this little switch between the two of us, if you hopped in late, please remember to fill out the poll about these interest areas. Andrew mentioned them at the beginning of the webinar, and I'm going to forget them off the top of my head, but I believe it's education, mental health, social media, and peer and family relationships, because we'll use that for the breakout rooms where you get to practice these framing strategies. So as Adriana mentioned, we worked for several years in an iterative process on identifying the core science, but once we had identified, once we had it, we still had to deliver it well. And so again, in partnership with frameworks, they identified several key strategies for talking about adolescent development. And many of us at the Center for the Developing Adolescent and on the National Scientific Council have been using these for several years. And I guess I just want to upfront say that some of the changes have been harder to make than others, but you definitely can teach old dogs new tricks. So what Adriana and I wanted to do in this section was select a few of these strategies that we had personally found to be really helpful and that we find we're using a lot when we speak about adolescence. Next slide, please. So the first one, and you've already heard this mentioned several times today, is to balance negative perceptions of adolescence by advancing a positive vision of young people and their development. And so the first little text box you see here is a sentence, with a message about adolescent development, kind of a before, and we'll, read this. It says, younger adolescents are vulnerable to peer pressure because they're still developing the skill to make their own decisions and develop resilience. Now with a reframe, and if you can click to the next slide, you'll see how this could be improved on by using the strategy of putting the positive first. So in this version, we see that younger adolescents are developing skills to make good decisions and build their resilience. That is a much more positive frame than the first version. And how do they do this? They need space for positive interactions with peers to fully develop these skills. So that's a good example of something we've been talking about already today, this what, but also some of the how. You're saying, how do they do this? How do they develop these positive skills? In this strategy, some of the other things to think about are, and this, I try to remind myself of this whenever I'm trying to use this strategy, is that you don't want to find yourself on the defense, right? What is it? No, it's usually the best offense, the good defense. But no, let's flip that, let's reframe that and say, you want to reframe. So you're not constantly rebutting or kind of trying to defend against these negative perceptions. And the order really matters here. If you start with the negative and then rebut it, what they're remembering and what they've digested first is the negative scenarios, negative framing that you've presented. There are a number of other elements or ways you can do this so that are effective. Things like amplifying the stories that young people tell about themselves. And these stories about youth activism, youth engagement, how youth are part of their communities and engaged in them. Those are ways to get that positive message across. I want to admit, and this is something that we wrestle with on the council and at the center, that well, one, it's difficult to shift the narrative when it's so easy to start with these risks, these bad outcomes, and as scientists, in the way that our funding models are sometimes or are frequently aligned, that's what you start with. And so it is really a mindset change, but it's really, really valuable and worth it. On the other hand, we have talked a lot and wrestle with ourselves how to balance this. You're kind of threading a needle, because some of these issues, they are so important. There's the actual risks. If you overblow the positive, you kind of get to that point of appearing Pollyannish, and it can be hard to take the message seriously. Some groups will say, you just don't understand how serious this is. So it is really a tightrope you're walking here, that you want to maintain credibility, but lead with the positive and frame it positively. And in some areas, in some domains, that can be more difficult than others. Let's see, next slide. We're going to just pass back and forth. Adriana, you want to take this one?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so one thing that we found in working with frameworks is that using discovery metaphors to explain how adolescents benefit from opportunities to try things out and learn is really helpful, because that's actually what adolescents are doing. And in fact, anyone, all stages of development, we learn through discovery, we learn through trial and error. So framing that in a positive way is actually accurate. Adolescents do learn through discovery and exploration and trial and error, but ensuring that the words and the verbs that you use in conjunction with it are positive. So instead of thinking about or saying young people develop through opportunities for learning and new experiences. Okay, next slide. One way to frame that is to say, when young people have the opportunity to explore new terrains, they develop the skills they need to become contributing adults. So, the first one is correct, that they do develop through opportunities for learning and new experiences. But the second one frames it as saying, when we give them the opportunity to do this, they thrive. They go beyond what they may learn on their own, or with the opportunities available to them. And so being creative and expressing the metaphor in multiple ways is also helpful. So talking about how we can create opportunities for discovery-based learning is important. And this is, I think, actually quite effective when speaking to stakeholders in the education space or in other spaces where discovery and learning are inherently a part of the conversation. Using language that includes exploration and trial and error learning to talk about identity formation is also relevant. We may not often think about trial and error learning as associated with identity formation, but certainly it is. That during adolescence, we try on different hats, and that's completely okay. We're finding ourselves and finding out the identity that best suits our who we are. And explaining how resources and environments shape opportunities for discovery-based learning is really important. And finally, I think, and Jen, I think you mentioned this, that repetition is really powerful, that saying things in multiple ways and in multiple times in multiple spaces is really effective. Right. So one other thing we found is that talking about development as a process and a journey is really important, that adolescents and, some of the language I shared in the beginning that is sometimes finds its way to headlines is that adolescents are doomed. And that's a really deterministic way of talking about adolescence. And instead, talking about the process or journey that we're all on as adolescents is important. Okay, next slide, Jen.
Okay, thanks, Adriana. So I think this is actually one of my favorite frames, and I find myself using this all the time. So, and we saw, again, we saw some evidence of this, that when Nat was presenting these kind of randomized, oh, see, I did it too. This must be universal. Like the randomization into this sort of community value versus vulnerability when thinking about early childhood mental health. And I find this kind of framing approach to think about the value of community and the connections and how adolescents are part of they're part of the community. Here, let's go through these two examples. So an original sentence here would be, supporting adolescents can improve not only their personal well-being, but their academic and professional success. And you might think, hey, well, that's kind of good. We are talking about the positives. There's some good things here, right? But how can we improve it? So on the next slide, you can see on the after version is that supporting the adolescents leads to healthier and more connected communities. And there are lots of things you can think about this. One, you know, these items, these positive things that they can develop that are listed in the before frame, they're sort of individual focused, you know, their personal well-being, things that they're doing, and can kind of inadvertently lead to, again, this, you know, their personal well-being, them versus us. So you're getting kind of this othering happening through that type of frame. But also just that when you can help draw out the links between adolescents and how they're interconnected and a vital part of our communities. You also, in particular, provide spaces and ways to talk about marginalized, about historically and persistently underserved youth. And then, as best as you can, when you have that information, when you have the information available, you would want to try and explain again, what are the hows of how adolescent development relates to community level outcomes that are important. And so I find that, again, a key element of this is talking about using the term we when we talk about adolescents. It's not they, it's not their personal interests, but that investing in adolescents is investing in the future of our communities. We're all in the community and we're in this together. And I think it's a really powerful frame that I find myself relying on a lot. Adriana, do you want to do the next one?
Yeah. Okay, so forecasting the future effects of adolescent development is also important. So here we have another before and after. So the before is high school students who have strong relationships with their teachers are more likely to graduate from high school. Next slide. And then after, supporting strong relationships with teachers is one way to increase the high school graduation rate, which in turn builds a stronger workforce and a more robust economy, will also resonate with a particular population of your audience. So knowing that adolescence, as I mentioned before, isn't just a static point in time, but is a part of a journey or a process is really important to remind people of. I think we all know that, having all been adolescents, but it is important to remember that this messaging should be repeated to those who may not be thinking about adolescence in this way. Okay, next slide. Oh, I think we were going to skip this one for now, right? We have these resources available.
Yeah, and I think just to wrap up what Adriana said, and just I think hopefully what you've seen is that once you start down this framing journey, it's a process of discovery, right? You find the ways that they actually are intertwined, and so you know that recommendation, that last strategy that Adriana talked about. I just, you know, they all link together. It ties so well to community values. It ties to this positive frame, this sort of the first strategy. And so some of those, some of those are individual level items on that sort of do and don't checklist. And as Andrew is mentioning in the chat, all of those materials are available on our websites, and we'll also share links to resources at the end of the workshop. But now I think we're just basically on time here to switch to.
Yeah, I think the breakout rooms. Yeah, so now you'll all have a chance to apply some of these framing concepts to your own work, and each of us will be a part of the breakout group so we can help guide the discussion if there are questions. As Jen mentioned previously, you'll have a chance to pick breakout rooms based on the 4 topics, and I think you've all communicated that your preference through the poll. Some of these topics I think will have multiple rooms based on the interest levels from the earlier poll, so feel free to sort yourselves among them. And as I mentioned, one of the presenters will be a part of each of these different breakout groups. So as we go, we want to know what's working for you, where you have some questions, where you may be stuck. So we'll put in the chat a link to a Jamboard. And if you aren't familiar with this, this is basically a virtual or digital whiteboard where you can add sticky notes. And you can add about what's most helpful and where you have questions.
Thanks, Megan. On my end, I see a blank slide. I don't know if others can see any text on the slide.
I see a blank slide also.
Okay. Oh, Megan's screen sharing abilities are paused.
You give me 1 second. Let me see what's going on.
Williams. I am co-director of the National Scientific Council on Adolescence with Jen, who you heard from earlier. Oh, there are the slides. Thank you. And I am excited to be presenting with Marissa Gerstein-Pinot from Frameworks about framing racial equity and adolescence. So what we're going to do is essentially build upon what we heard in part 1 of today. Megan, if you could go to the next slide. So I think the first question that we should all be asking is, why do we want to connect adolescence and racial equity? Megan, if you advance, I think there may be some text. Actually, if you go back a slide, I'm not sure where the text went, but I can tell you what it says. And I'll also share a resource that has this information in it. It's important that we are connecting adolescence and racial equity in addition to all of the reasons that you heard about from Nat and from Adriana and from Jen. When we're talking about racial equity in particular, equitable systems and supports during adolescence are critical for healthy development. So it's really important that we are providing equitable systems and supports, which supports their ability to contribute to a stronger social fabric. We also know that adolescents are exploring their place in the world and they're primed for civic engagement, which makes them key partners in dismantling racism. So in thinking about adolescents, not just as sort of passive kind of targets of racism, they also can play an active role in anti-racist work. And also important is that public policies that are intended sometimes to address racial inequities don't always consider the needs of adolescents. So we really need to think carefully about, how do we message around policies that are going to be supportive in reducing inequities for adolescents in particular. Next slide. Thanks, Megan. So we have, or I'll say I have, and my colleagues have sort of grappled with some of these framings, and I'll give you 2 examples of where it's shown up, and I will post links to these resources in the chat once I turn it over to Marissa. I was on the consensus committee that produced the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine report in 2019 called The Promise of Adolescence, Realizing Opportunity for All Youth. Chapter 4 in the report is called Inequity and Adolescence, and it addresses disparities in multiple outcomes across 4 youth-serving sectors that are featured in the rest of the report. That includes education, justice, health, and child welfare. The chapter includes a multi-page table that documents differential outcomes across race, ethnicity, biological sex, family income, and sexuality. And one of the challenges, as you can imagine, in a chapter like this one, is that highlighting disparities can reinforce a deficit narrative about particular groups. So whether that be minoritized racial or ethnic or sexual identity groups, for example. So it's, essentially it's a key responsibility when it comes to framing around equity is remembering that we can't let the data speak for themselves. So the way we addressed it in this chapter is that the remainder of the chapter, as well as the introduction, documents specific sources of disparities in outcomes like family wealth and income, coupled with segregation by race and income at the neighborhood level, disparate institutional responses to adolescence that happen in the education system and the justice system and so on, as well as prejudicial treatment of adolescents by adults and peers. Those are not the only sources of inequity, but we honed in, because we were grounding it in available science, we honed in on those 3 driving factors that lead to disparate outcomes and contribute to disparities. So in a moment, you'll hear me sort of introduce the core principles of framing around racial equity. One of them includes the need to be thorough and specific in framing racial equity. Chapter 4 in the NASM report offers an example of how to do this. It goes beyond racial equity, but it addresses broad categories of inequity in adolescence. The second example which is pictured on the right, comes from the first report from our National Scientific Council on Adolescence called The Intersection of Adolescent Development and Anti-Black Racism. We were very intentional about grounding the report in the science of adolescence. We know that Black youth are often viewed as a special population, and they are often subjected to a deficit lens focused on shortcomings and problems. So it was important for us to remind readers that there are core developmental needs and strengths that all adolescents have, so that Black youth could be included in sort of all adolescents. So we connected the report to salient features of adolescence, like needs related to identity development and belonging, as well as to exploration and agency. In addition, we were intentional about why we focused on Black youth. We defined terms like racism and anti-racism. We attended to processes at multiple levels, so interpersonal racism and structural racism. And also critically important, we reminded readers throughout the report of the rich diversity that exists among Black youth. So, and we explained why we need to sort of talk at the collective level as well as recognize heterogeneity in Black youth communities. All right, next slide, please. So when we think about how to talk about racial equity in adolescence, these points come from a resource that was developed and published by Frameworks in 2021, and we will share this resource out with everybody. There's kind of 3 buckets of categories with some specific guidance for each of those. So connecting to powerful values, we'll talk today about the value of opportunity for all, emphasizing community connections, which we heard about earlier, and connecting to anti-racist advocacy and engagement to healthy development. Spotlighting experiences is another critical sort of point of guidance for framing. That includes amplifying the voices of youth of color, talking about supporting parents. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, being thorough and specific. We must responsibly explain the causes and consequences of inequity rather than allowing people to draw their own conclusions about, individuals being sort of the source of the disparities or being at fault for any disparate outcomes. So we need to name the causes of disparities, and we need to explain racism as institutional and not just interpersonal, although of course it operates at the interpersonal level as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Marissa, who is going to talk about some of the examples of these frames. And Megan, I think if you go back maybe 1 slide, we might have bumped over one.
Great, thank you, Joanna. And what Joanna and I are going to do next is alternate some of the recommendations that came out of what I posted as the first link in the chat that organizes a larger group of recommendations for talking about race and equity in adolescent to sort of more bite-sized chunks. And then we're breaking down some of that because we could talk for a much longer period of time about every single one of those recommendations. But I'm going to start by talking about the 2 values that are recommended that are based on our research around framing that you've actually seen already in some of the work that Jen and Adriana presented. And I just want to set it up by talking about what we mean when we're talking about values. And what we're saying when we talk about values are these ideas, these sort of enduring beliefs that help orient how people want to think about and behave when they hear particular pieces of information. So I prefer to think of it as the why does this matter frame. It's what brings people in, gets them interested, raises the salience of a particular social issue or social problem. And these are embedded throughout our culture. And as we know from our work, some values work better for talking about certain issues, and some values work better for talking about other issues. And actually, you saw that when Nat showed that graph of how to talk about child mental health. So if we can go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about opportunity for all, which again, you already saw, but just embedding this language of opportunities and the fact that everyone needs opportunities, that this needs to be inclusive, that it needs to be opportunities that all young people have access to, and not just that these opportunities are available, right? So because the implication of opportunities being available is that then you have to sort of, as an individual, reach out and grab them, but they need to be accessible. They need to be something that that young people can actually access, that are readily available, that are there for them, not to have to reach alone, but in interaction with the systems and institutions that they work with. And opportunity is a really great value to use in shorter communications because it does signal so much to people. It is something that people really hold dear as part of our sort of cultural understanding of who we are as a country, right? We're the land of opportunity. So if you go to the next value. So the second is community connections. So in addition to opportunity, Americans have a really strong sense of valuing community in whatever way that means to them. It can be kind of a vague term, but what it does, again, is it brings people into the discussion around adolescence. So when you talk about the importance of adolescent development, because it benefits all of us through the community connections that they develop and are able to maintain, is another really great way to talk about why we need to care about adolescent development. And then, of course, using community connections overlaps with discussions about young people's engagement and their advocacy, and the importance of that in terms of young people being a force for good and joining in on social movements, et cetera. And so again, it's something that it cues something with people, with members of the public, that really gets them engaged in this conversation. So I think Joanna's going to take the next slide. So if we can move to that. Oh, and sorry, I forgot. You can put these together, right? So if you go to the next slide, you don't have to stick to one value or another. You can put them together. And that is actually the case with every frame we recommend. Obviously, in a shorter communication, you might need to just take one frame or another, or the type of communication who you're talking to. Some frames will work better than others, but ideally across all of your communications, you're going to embed as many frames as possible. So sorry, now it's to turn it over to Joanna.
Thank you, Marissa.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so going back to the one of the sort of guiding principles in terms of spotlighting experiences, that's important in terms of the work of framing, in part because audiences can relate to experiences. And there's other reasons that it's important as well. So one of the ways to do this when you're talking about racial equity and adolescence is to amplify the voices of youth of color. In the frameworks guidance that Marissa put the link in the chat to, they, I think, really nicely talk about the importance of this that is tied actually back to the developmental science. And that is that adolescents are maturing cognitively in ways that help them appreciate the influences and complexities of race and racism in new ways. So when we talk about racial equity during adolescence and during adolescence with a CE and among adolescents with an NTS, we need to help incorporate the concerns, perspectives, and ideas of those who are the content experts. That includes the young people who are most impacted by racial inequities. Centering youth voices in this way also helps to push back against the perception that youth of color are one monolithic group, which I talked about earlier. In fact, and we mentioned this in the National Scientific Council report on anti-Black racism and adolescent development, that sharing a racial identity, so identifying with the label of Black or African American, does not guarantee that youth have similar perspectives on problem solutions or even what race means to them in their own lives. So when young people are given space to talk about their own experiences, they're more likely to then portray the full range of their identities. They may speak to challenges, but they also can speak to joy. So the joy of being part of their racial or ethnic group, as well as aspects of themselves that aren't about race. On the slide, what you see there visually is a link to a Twitter post. And I want to put in a quick plug for the Center for Developing Adolescent podcast episode called "This Is Me, Race and Identity in Adolescence." And there are two young women who both identify as Black, who talk about their experiences of being Black and women in STEM fields. And we have a sort of middle adolescent and an older adolescent or emerging adult. And you hear sort of a more holistic portrayal of their experiences, where Black is one part of their identity, being in STEM is one part of their identity, and you see the ways in which those identities really intersect in how they view themselves. So including direct youth voices when possible in communications about racial equity in adolescence is important for framing. So I will now pass it back on to Marissa to talk about one of the last specific examples of how we do some of this framing work.
Great, thank you. So if we can go to the next slide. Oh, so I think there was one just before this. Thank you. So the next thing that I wanted to talk about was explanatory chains and the ways in which you can use these, especially when you're talking about racial disparities and institutional racism, et cetera, to take the knowledge that you have as somebody who is an expert in all of this and convey it in ways that are much more clear to people who don't have your knowledge, can't really easily access this information. And what you're doing is you're using a sequence. So you're talking about what affects what are the results of that, and what to do about it. And one of the things that I really love too about explanatory chains is that they make you slow down and really think through what it is, what the issue or problem is that you're trying to communicate by filling out this chain, because there's so many ways in which when we are experts on something, we're able to kind of use a shorthand in our heads and skip over certain parts, so that it seems very obvious that if there's this cause, then the solution is that, or if there's this consequence, then we should obviously be doing this particular thing. And this really helps you slow down and think things through in ways that are much more clear for the people that you're talking to. So if you can just go to the next slide. So here's an example. I know there's a lot of text on here. I normally don't like to do text heavy slides, but again, because you want to be very explicit and concise and clear about what you're doing here, there's quite a bit of information. And I think we can actually send after this a blank version of this so that folks can go through and think about a particular issue that they're working on having to do with adolescence and fill this in. But this is an example of some work that's been done around race and racial inequities and the pandemic. Where you can see setting up what causes are, and then what the consequences are, and then what the solutions are in a very clear way that connect back to each other. I do, just as a side, want to say, and I know I do it here, I put in equity or inequity without defining it, but you always, always, always need to define what equity and inequities are, because members of the public have no idea what that word means. And of course, it's something that in our worlds, in health, education, development, et cetera, it's a word that's being increasingly used. But when you ask members of the public what they think equity means, they either say the value of their house or that we're talking about equality. So just make sure you're really clear about that. But here I started with sort of a high level cause, right? So talking about disadvantages such as racism, poverty, under-resourced, which we just talked about in the chat, schools that then create racial disparities. So if you're going to talk about racial disparities, you always need to say what is creating these disparities, because otherwise people just sort of default to types of thinking that we really want to avoid. So the reason racial disparities in educational outcomes by race occur is because, and this is where people tend to go, oh, maybe Black families don't value education like white families do, or, Black young people are just too concerned with music and peers, et cetera. So the explanations that people bring to mind and put on when they hear about disparities without explanation is really not unproductive, not where we want people to go. So that's a high level cause. And then you see a more proximate cause, sort of the next link in the chain, which is about specifically what's happening during the pandemic. And then as a consequence, how these two things combine to exacerbate obstacles to educational opportunities and learning for these particular group of young people. So having listed the causes and the consequence, then you get to a solution, which is, school systems should prioritize supports for young people of color and focus on providing social emotional learning. So this is not in this case, it's not a super precise solution, immediate solution. And I think you all can fill that in when you're talking about these types of issues because you have the deeper knowledge of what the immediate solutions are. But then there's a step even further out, just like there is a high level cause, there's a higher level solution about education systems needing to be redesigned. So this is an example of how you can actually walk people through how racial equity and inequities work so that they can really connect the dots in a way that they probably are not able to by themselves, or they will connect things to dots that we would just rather you don't connect to. So I think there should be a final slide that shows the activity for today. Is there one more slide, Megan?
It's okay, Marissa. I'm going to put it in the chat. You're muted, Marissa.
Thanks for reminding me. Okay, perfect. As we put it in the chat, and then if all the facilitators can maybe just make a copy, and when we break out, put it in the chats within the smaller groups so that we all have the ability to share it again. Sometimes when you break out, you lose the chat.
Yeah. So I'm going to put this in the chat. This was on the last slide. So what we're going to ask you to do in your breakout room, and I think you'll be with the same people again, is think about something related to race and or racial equity or inequity in adolescence that you want to communicate. And then we're going to push you to kind of walk through an explanatory chain. So, that means thinking about what is the cause, as you see here on this slide, what is a potential consequence, and what is a solution. And then you can think about the links that kind of connect the cause and the consequence as well. We know that this isn't easy work, so we'll ask people to, as you're trying to work on creating an explanatory chain, what are you struggling with and what are you finding difficult to explain? The last thing that I'll say, this is a note really to facilitators. I was previously in the breakout room focused on education, and the current example of sort of poorly framed messages related to education and adolescence speaks to some of these. So if you're struggling to come up with examples, you might click into that Google Doc because there's plenty of poorly framed and poorly explained messages about racial equity in adolescence in the context of education that you can draw from if you want to, pull an example from there to work through together as a group. And there, I imagine that people in individual groups may have also be able to generate their own examples. So we will move into breakout rooms. I think we have about 25 minutes or so in our breakouts. I want to thank Marissa again for those resources and the slides, and looking forward to actually getting to do some work on practicing these strategies.
Right now is just what we have now is what we have now is a little bit of time to reflect upon what we've been discussing over the last couple of hours. I encourage you to ask any questions you have or any insights that you've had. It could be based upon that last breakout that we just had, which I think probably for all of you was very challenging, I'm guessing. as it was for us in our group. There may be some specific issues to that, or more generally, are there any questions you may have? Also, you can look at the Jamboard. I can put the link to the Jamboard up one last time. Oh, it's already up there. That's great. Take a look at sort of the Q&A on the Jamboard. That would be on the second page if you want to raise any of those questions. So we'll just throw it out there. Raise your hand and we'll call on you. Okay, I will voice one of the questions that's on the Jamboard. This gets right to the Rachel. Oh, before I do that, let's go to Anna.
Well, we had a really fun conversation in both of our breakout rooms. And I think that one of the things that we were really wrestling with is, and I think that Carlin dropped off, or otherwise I'd ask her to voice it.
Carlin's here.
Oh, there she is. All
Yeah.
right. Carlin, do you want to talk about sort of what you advised us to do in that first one about falling in love with the problem? Or do you want me to cover it and then you can jump in?
Yeah, I can start it off. I don't even remember how we got there. But anyway, we were talking about how so often when we come to spaces, we immediately think about solutions. Like what's the solution to this? You know, how do we get at it? Blah, blah, blah. And I really learned this from design thinking. The model should actually be the opposite. Like we have to spend more time with the problem, right? Fall in love with the problem, really get to know what the issue is that we're addressing in the first place. Who is it an issue for? What do they say about it? How do they feel about it? And why are we investigating this at the beginning versus starting our conversation with solutions? So I'm gonna throw it back to you if you want to add on to that.
Yeah, I think we spent a lot of time talking about that in the first part. And I think that it really tied to some of the challenges we had with the explanatory chain, because you can actually go through this entire explanatory chain without defining the problem. Because sometimes the consequences, like what we're seeing as being manifested, doesn't actually tell us what the problem is. And often what the problem that experts from the outside will identify is not the problem that the community sees. And so I think that is something that is really, I think it's an interesting opportunity to look at like sort of how this works and how we think about it. And I think that the other like piece of richness that I really was taking away from our conversation is the importance of giving youth voice. And we came up with a piece that I think we identified as missing from the core story, that adolescents are actually really primed to tell their story, and they receive a lot of reward from that. They also haven't been socialized not to tell their story. They haven't been told yet that they're supposed to keep it private. And it's missing a little bit from the core story, because also that's a critical part of scaffolding. What often happens in the field is there's this socialization about adults aren't supposed to tell adolescents their story. They're supposed to stop sharing their experiences. They're not supposed to do that anymore. And that almost leads to this like void in the quality of the scaffolding that we can provide to young people, because one, we're not hearing their story, and two, we're not able to support them with our experiences and be able to share those with them. So those were just things that we came up with in our time.
Excellent. Thanks, Carlin. Thanks for bringing that up, and Anna for amplifying it. Other questions? Any things that you were struggling with as you were working through the causal chain? Anyone, or any other insights, suggestions? I have one that let me just amplify something I saw on the board. Racial inequality issues are so big. How can we talk about solutions? And if anyone else wants to chime in as well, but I know that Frameworks has thought about this a lot, about when you're dealing and talking about structural issues, how do you avoid falling into the trap of just making them seem so unsolvable that you lose your audience? And that's a delicate dance to engage in. I don't know if others in the room have ideas about how to do that, or if Nat or Marissa want to come in. But how do we talk about solutions without ignoring the deep structural issues that are involved at play in here?
Can I add something to that? Yeah.
You do.
Yeah, I think it just goes again to what our group just love talking about. Spend more time thinking about racial inequity and what the issue is there before we really begin to think about what solutions we need to come up with. Sure, and I know all of us probably are like, but I've read all the books and I've done this and whatever, but you can never spend too much time just really sitting with the problem. And I think another thing that a lot of research is really pointing at now, along this idea of transformational justice, we all want to just be like, okay, I'm ready to go out, hit the ground running and tackle this. But it actually starts within. Like a lot of these inequitable systems that we see on the outside, we've adapted and we've like really have embraced in ways that we don't always see. So not only is it first really sitting with the problem of racial inequity and the stories around it and the hardship that it's caused folks, but it's also taken some really intentional time to sit with how we have digested this and have worn some of this on our own before we can really think about how is the world now transformed? Because the reality is the world is transformed when we are transformed, right? Like when we are able to be a better version of ourselves and to unpack, to take off or put on, we then really get to see a lot of that transformation and change and solution happen.
Well said again, Carlin. Well said.
So I don't want to talk about solutions after Carlin has told me that I shouldn't be thinking about solutions. So
No,
I don't know if I'm going to answer your question, Andrew.
Talk about solutions.
So I won't go all the way there, but and I don't know how helpful this is. I think so. So the organizations that we tend to work with are, progressive do-gooders who want to, like Carlin's saying, like change the world and all the structures and systems that support all the bad crap that characterize it currently. And so what they do is they tend to go just to, these hand wavy messages about systems change and structural solutions, this, that, and the other. And we know, and I don't think you need research to tell you that, like, that's not a super effective way of getting people engaged in thinking that problems can be solved and in thinking concretely about what that looks like. And so a lot of the push that we give folks is around examples, kind of examples where some of these systemic problems have been solved and where they have been solved by people understanding those problems, people working together to address them. And those examples of a structural problem addressed by people doing stuff are worth their weight in gold. And those are the ways, that's one way that you really kind of get people over this hump of seeing anything that's in a system as being unsolvable. If you give them some concrete example, a story about a community who was affected by a system, who did something about it to change the system and improve outcomes, that's awesome stuff. And it's not just enough to say structural racism and keep saying it, which is what I've largely seen over the last 2 years. That's not a solution. Like, let's address structural racism is not a solution. And in some ways, we've seen that make the problem worse, because once you've put the problem in a solution, once you've put the solution in a system, as you've said, Andrew, it can get people to feel even more fatalistic about our ability to do anything about it. And we've done that at Frameworks. Like, early on in my career, I did a lot of work on justice reform, and I was all about kind of getting people to see the way that systems disproportionately impact communities of color, and was successful in some of that work, but found that as soon as I could kind of get people to think that way, they became totally fatalistic in their belief that anything could be done about the problem. So as soon as you got it in the system, people were like, well, let's just move on to the next thing because we know we can't solve that one. And I think that happens on issues of education, which our group talked about, and a whole bunch of other stuff. So I don't know if any of that was helpful. I'll just be quiet and maybe Carlin can talk a little bit more because that worked much better.
The combination of the two of you, the points that you have made to get what you're talking about, Nat, requires what Carlin was talking about. I think that if you're going to get beyond just simply saying eliminate structural racism, you have to do what Carlin was talking about. So I think it was really a wonderful combination of comments. Thank you so much. One thing that came up in our conversation, our room, and I see a couple of things on the note board, and this reflects back across the whole workshop we had, is the phrase, we have to turn off our academic brains, came up as one thing. And then also related to that is the demands of appealing to funding organizations and the communication you have to them versus the kinds of communication that we're talking about today. And I don't know if other people want to reflect upon that, but just to underline it, we are trained to write in a certain way as researchers. You start with the problem, and then you talk about how you studied it. And if you want money either from the national funding organizations or even at the state level for programs and policies, whether it be for H or after school, you have to identify a need and a problem. And so we're trained to think and write in a certain way. And many times that's not the most effective way when you're speaking to different kinds of audiences. I don't know if other folks have reflections upon that, but I think that's captures a main theme of what we've been talking about this morning or this afternoon if you're on the East Coast.
Andrew, I just want to challenge that. I think as academics and even as like service providers, we are encouraged to think about the solution in a categorical way. And that actually causes some of the gap. So for example, we may be looking at there's really high teen pregnancy rates. And so our solution is going to be that we need to increase sex education and get contraception. That's categorically, it may drive our research. It may also drive our service provision. But the problem is we don't actually know what the problem is there. Okay, so what is the actual problem? Is the problem that people don't have access to contraception? Is the problem that people are having unintended pregnancies? Is the problem that there's inequities in people's access? Is it that there's not enough adequate support for young mothers? What is the problem? And I think I want to be careful because I don't think we often know what the problem is.
Yeah, and a point I made in our chat about that is that the young people also don't know what the problem is, right? And so when you're coming at them with solutions, it's really challenging if you haven't identified why they should be concerned or what the negative outcomes are.
And I'll just say, I will not talk as long as I just did, but Anna, I think that part of what you're on is part of what a causal chain pushes you to do, right? It doesn't just allow you to say, there's this problem and this solution, done. But it forces you to kind of do some of that thinking and that exposition that Carlin was talking about, that if you want to create, and our group had, and I don't think I was very helpful, a lot of trouble with the causal chain, in part because we picked something that was really hard to like work back from to a cause. But I don't think that you can move to engagement and solutions until you've kind of like specified those links or several of them that happen in between the kind of the beginning and the end of one of those causal chains. So I think that exercise is not only helpful from a communications perspective, but it's helpful from kind of a more engagement and strategic perspective as well.
Well, and not just to push back a little bit. So we were able to do the entire causal chain using actually teen pregnancy as an example and never figure out what the problem was. So I think that between the cause, the consequence and the solution, you still have to know what the problem is. So there can be consequences that things that result, but that still doesn't mean that that's a problem. So for example, if young women are having babies, that can be a consequence, but we don't know if that is a problem. We can find a lot of solutions to make that consequence go away, but we don't know if there's a problem there.
So I think part of this comes from the fact that we did our causal chain differently. Like I come from the way back on causal chains before Marissa's kind of innovated them. And so how we used to do them was cause, consequence, and intervening mechanism. And so you're not concerned with solutions, but you're concerned with connecting a cause to a consequence through a process, if that makes sense. So just a quick example, like, so we picked the kind of consequence that we were interested in was, the massive differences in representation in higher education in certain fields. And the kind of what Jade in our group talked about is kind of the missing voices and missing lenses of lived experience in particular fields, STEM among them, but other ones as well. So that was our end. That was the consequence. And the cause was kind of faculty don't represent the students that they serve. That was one of the causes. And so our discussion was about how do you get from faculty don't represent the students they serve to that end consequence. And what that forces you to do is it forces you to kind of get into mechanism and think about what the processes are that explain or connect that cause with that consequence. So we didn't even talk about solutions. We were really just having the discussion that Carlin was talking about. And we didn't get all the way there because that's a really hard, those mechanisms in between those things are numerous and deep. And we decided that we all needed to go back to school and study sociology in order to do that. And that's the place we got. But I guess my question back to you, Anna, was, is it different, or anybody, like, is it different if you're less concerned with solutions and you take the kind of the causal chain exercise as an invitation to really dig into process and mechanism and figure out how to represent that in some clear and concise ways? You don't have to answer that, but.
I'll jump in. Do you mind, Anna? I'm not going to answer directly your question, Nat, but as I was listening to the conversation between the two of you, when I think about the causal chain process, I think part of it allows us, to Anna's point, or pushes us to think about positioning a particular causal mechanism. And in part of the work around racial inequity in particular, is that oftentimes without, in the absence of framing, the cause is often assumed to be the people themselves, so people of color or Black people. So in the example that Marissa shared, the first, the causal factor that was named were persistent disadvantages such as racism, poverty, and under-resourced schools create racial disparities in educational achievement. So starting with that there are these, structural inequalities is the starting point, rather than starting with kind of, as you pointed to, Anna, starting with the consequence, which might be related to, disparities in academic outcomes or in, whatever the other domains may be. And so I think that there is value in being able to kind of assert some, assert a particular cause as a starting point. And whether or not the solutions, are included in part of the explanatory chain, I think depends on, where you are and what you're doing with the information. To the point that Andrew was making, and I think comes from my understanding of frameworks, the work that you're doing, is that when you get into spaces like this, where you're talking about, causal factors or, issues of inequity, when you only sort of have the conversation about structural inequality, people may get overwhelmed and shut down and move away from thinking about, well, there's actually effective ways of changing, of, creating change. And it may be at a very localized, specific level, because causes are complex and multiplex, and they may look different depending on where you are and who you are. So I think the solutions piece can be effective in terms of demonstrating where things have worked, so that people realize, like, oh, wait, maybe I can actually contribute to something or take some action. But I think you can begin to do the work of linking, like positioning the cause, as opposed to letting people determine on their own what the cause is. Especially, when I think about the issue of teen pregnancy, like multiple root causes likely. So if you're able to use your voice to name a specific one that's informed by the people whose lived experience that is, then you start pointing to, okay, what are we know what the consequences are, but what are the strategies?
It's super helpful. I was saying in my earlier conversation, like I think my brain hurts a little bit, and I'm not feeling like I'm going to be most articulate about this. I think that it is really interesting to think about that relationship between the cause and the consequence. And I think that in order to take action, we still have to clarify what the problem is. And I think that we often don't. And I think that that is actually one of the, and we talked a little bit about this in our group. Carlin had raised that if you ask people, what are the solutions you need? They're going to give you a laundry list of things that they need. And we can't provide all of those. But if we get very clear about what the problem is we're trying to solve, it may come to a greater precision of understanding what solution might actually fix that problem. And it may be very different and there may be very different opportunities to think about it. And I think that having those exemplars of like things that have worked, but I think it also pushes us to think about what our assumptions are in understanding. We had a nice discussion also about this idea about if we can pull away from, I think that if we can think about ways to create a sense of community and defining what the problem is, that also can bring people together to create more impactful solutions. And I think that sometimes we miss that step.
Thanks. Wonderful. I think this preceding discussion just highlighted the importance of the wisdom that she had expressed earlier of falling in love with the problem. What we just witnessed in a meta kind of way of a group of people falling in love with the problem of identifying the problem. But I just also want to reflect on one other thing, and that is we've talked about all of this as a communications challenge, but I think what is been identified here is by going through this process, this also will identify what we're missing from a research standpoint. And I think the point that Anna and was pushing and everyone was responding to is if you go through this logical argument discussion amongst yourselves and with your colleagues and with youth and whomever is invested, you will identify what we don't know and how little we can say about certain things and how to be cautious. So I do think that this causal chain approach is really useful to really helping us to think about generating our research. And it's a great example of how we really should be combining these communication strategies with our research strategies in the first place. And I'll just, I see Sarah Roach is on here, and she's a student with my lab, but that's something we've been talking about a little bit more about fully integrating communication with our identification of the research problem in the first place. Very hard to do. But with that, I guess I'm going to take the privilege of having the last word. We have 3 minutes left. We appreciate so much, we collectively, the Frameworks Institute, the National Scientific Council on Adolescence, the UCLA Center for the Developing Adolescent. Thank you for joining us today. This has really been a stimulating discussion, and we hope it has been useful for you. We're going to be sending an email with links to the Frameworks Toolkit, the core science and the core story. We're also going to give you a link to this neat game that Frameworks invited us to help develop with them, called From 10 to 25. There's a website, and it's basically a way to get your audiences and congregations and folks you work with to actually go through this process in a very real kind of way. To think about what youth need and how we can communicate and identify their needs. It's called From 10 to 25. There's a website, you can play it online, or you can order some free decks to play in an in-live audience. And then finally, if you'd like any additional information, please feel free to contact the UCLA CDA Communications Director. I'm going to ask Megan to put her email into the chat right now. But finally, we just really want to thank SRA for giving us the opportunity to share this work with you. And please, by all means, be in contact with us as you start framing and engaging in this hard work of framing your work on adolescence and communicating it to the public. So thanks again. Have a great day. Have a great weekend. So long.